And the ceasefire took effect in Sudan ahead of a pledging conference to raise the funds for the humanitarian assistance. Residents in the capital Khartoum and its neighboring city of Omdurman reported relative calm in the first hours of a ceasefire on Sunday morning after fierce clashes were reported in the previous day. More details with Samah Sharif.
Sudan's warring parties began a ceasefire Sunday morning after 2 months of fighting pushed the African nation into chaos. Residents in the capital Khartoum and its neighboring city of Omdurman reported relative calm in the first hours of the ceasefire Sunday morning after fierce clashes were reported the previous day. The 3-day truce came ahead of a pledging conference the UN and other nations will organize Monday to raise funds to cover Sudan's humanitarian needs. The UN says it received less than 16% of the $2.57 billion required to help those in need in Sudan in 2023. Another $470 million more are needed to support refugees in the Horn of Africa region. The US and Saudi Arabia announced the ceasefire agreement Saturday. Both led concerted international diplomatic efforts to stop the war over the past 2 months. The US and Saudi Arabia said in a joint statement that the military and its rival paramilitary group, the Rapid Support Forces, agreed to halt fighting and refrain from seeking military advantage during the ceasefire. Sudan plunged into chaos after months of worsening tensions between the rival generals exploded into open fighting in mid-April across the country, with the capital Khartoum and the western Darfur region bearing the brunt of the armed conflict. The fighting turned Khartoum and other urban areas into battlegrounds. More than 3,000 people lost their lives and over 6,000 others were wounded. The conflict forced more than 2.2 million people to flee their homes to safer areas inside Sudan and to neighboring nations. The ceasefire was the latest in a series of attempted truces brokered by the US and Saudi Arabia, all of which failed to stop fighting, with the mediators blaming the two warring sides for repeated violations.
Distraught families gathered at a mortuary in western Uganda on Sunday for any news of their loved ones after militant attack left dozens of students dead and other missings. The army and police have blamed the Allied Democratic Front, the ADF, which is a militia based in the DRC, who fled back to their border with 6 abductees in the captivity after the attack. More details.
In Uganda, officials say at least 41 people, mostly students, were massacred at a secondary school near the border of the Democratic Republic of the Congo late Friday by militants. Victims were hacked, shot and burned to death in a brutal attack at Lohibiriha Secondary School in Mpwende that has shocked Uganda and drawn condemnation from around the globe. The army and police have blamed the Allied Democratic Front ADF, a militia based in DR Congo, who fled back to the border with 6 abductees in captivity after the attack. The military said it was pursuing the attackers and would recover those kidnapped. Many of the victims were burned beyond recognition when the attackers set a locked dormitory ablaze, frustrating efforts to identify the dead and account for the missing. At a mortuary in Bwere, a town near where the attack occurred, families wailed as the bodies of their loved ones were put into coffins and taken away for burial. But for many others, there was no news of missing relatives. Many of those killed in the fire were transferred to the city of Fort Portal, where DNA testing can be conducted. It is the deadliest militant attack in Uganda since 2010, when 76 people were killed in twin bombings in Kampala by the Somalia-based Al-Shabaab.
Welcome back. Prime Minister Dr. Mustafa Madbouli stressed Egypt's support to the efforts exerted to settle the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, indicating that the African joint action will resume to achieve the comprehensive peace. This came during the Prime Minister's participation on behalf of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in a meeting of the Russian President Vladimir Putin and several African heads of state who arrived in St. Petersburg City with the initiative to settle the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. To shed more light on the issue, we are very much delighted to be joined over the phone by Mr. Raouf Gaafar, our political analyst. Mr. Gaafar, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon to you, my dear.
Sir, how do you see the reasons for Africa's desire to be involved in settling the Russian-Ukrainian crisis?
African continent in general, I think, suffered the most. It's conflict. A lot of African states depend on food products coming from this part of the world, from these two countries particularly. Egypt is not an exception. A lot of wheat comes from this direction. A lot of oil comes from this direction, and these are vital things for the food of the people. And a lot of African countries suffer as well. So this initiative came to try and convince the two parts to settle their differences and reach a sort of a peace settlement one way or the other, so that the agony of the African states stop a little bit. We all know that the lines of provision have been interrupted so many times, and this is not, of course, good for the people of these African states, and that is why we will try to find a way for the two sides to settle and to agree on some kind of, I don't know, hopefully peace. But anyway, in this direction, any effort is blessed, of course.
Indeed. Sir, actually, Cairo said that the African joint action will resume to achieve a comprehensive peace. How do you weigh here the response to the African move by the Russians and Ukrainians?
Well, so far they have been very much welcomed in Ukraine and in Russia as well. The people in both countries listen to them carefully. Of course, interest of the two sides has to be kept. I mean, there is an interest not only in the African states, but as well in Ukraine and Russia, because they are the suppliers. So it's the benefit from the two sides. They have listened well. They have understood the complexity of the situation, and I hope they listen, and maybe, I don't know, I mean, we pray that things will turn on positively. Hope so, yes.
Yes, indeed. Sir, also Cairo expressed hope to end the conflict through reaching a kind of ceasefire. How do you see the prospects for a ceasefire between the two sides in the near future?
I mean, ceasefire, in my humble opinion, this is not the objective. I mean, it's not a result. I mean, to ceasefire for maybe humanitarian reasons or whatever, but I mean, either it stops or it continues. But to ceasefire for a few days just to, it can help, of course, to resume the provision lines and so on and so forth. But again, a ceasefire is not the ultimate objective. I think a peace settlement, one way or the other, a compromise, one way or the other. I mean, it has to end one way. It is hurting everybody, the two fighting countries and the rest of the world. So I think we should aspire to a full-size peace rather than a simple ceasefire.
Indeed. Sir, Russian President Vladimir Putin welcomed the African leaders, stressing Russia's commitment to the African continent. How do you read this statement by the Russian president, sir?
Of course. I mean, Egypt, Africa is very important for Russia. And we have noticed the presence of Russia in Africa, in Egypt as well. We have a lot of common interests. We have a lot of projects, joint venture projects undergoing, a lot of mega projects even with Russia, not only in Egypt, but in a lot of African states. Africa represents a huge market for the Russian products and for the Russian industrial complexes and what have you. So the future is here. And this is why President Putin should listen carefully to the requests of this delegation, the high delegation,
Yes.
and really weigh things in the interest scale. And I think
Yes.
that if he listens well and he agrees, but again, it is not his decision.
Yes.
It is the decision of the other side as well. And Ukraine, we know that behind Ukraine lies the European Union, lies the United States, NATO, etc. So it is a blessed intervention. It's a blessed initiative, and I sincerely hope that it reaches at least some
Yes.
positive steps.
Indeed, Mr. Raouf Gaafar, our political analyst, thank you so much for your precious input. Always a pleasure. Our